I want to go into how it felt to be part of this thing, which was, as I've said before, was a huge production, a lot of people, and it was one of the craziest things I'd ever been involved with, because it had only been 3 years since I'd moved to LA from my hometown of Cheyenne, Wyoming, and this was it was all new to me, but it was a great experience. I found this sheet. These were some of the changes made to the tour. I wanted to see how long the tour was. It went from around the beginning of July through Friday, September 25th was the last day. And there were changes along the way. A couple of shows got canceled because Michael got sick. And nothing serious, but Michael, his work ethic was such that if he felt like he couldn't give his usual 1,000%, he would rather cancel the show and disappoint people that way than disappoint them by not putting on his usual ridiculous, outstanding performances that he used to do. So, because then we had some, we tried to make up the canceled shows, and I think we did. It complicated things, but that's, stuff happens like that on a tour. I have one more show and tell item. This was the tour jacket. Tour jackets were a thing then. I don't know if they still are or not. And this was a little different because usually the cliche tour jacket was black satin, and you'd have your name embroidered on it as this one does. But this is like a heavy duty. It's like a military style jacket with the epaulets and the piping. And I've got a Prophet 5 pin on it. And the back, you can see the logo. If this doesn't come through, we'll shoot a close-up of it. I'd model it for you, but over the years it seems to have shrunk just a little bit, I think. So, I guess this means that I was a sergeant. Is that right? I don't know. I didn't realize I had a rank. I was basically the keyboard player, that's all. Being on tour sounds glamorous if you've never been on one, and it is. And it's extremely exhilarating, the adrenaline you feel when you're playing for 20,000 screaming people. And even though they're not screaming for you, I'm just the keyboard player. It gets your adrenaline going, and you're pumped up, and you just want to give everything you've got. The only downside of touring is the other 22 hours of the day, and especially the times when we had some cancellations. It's like you're in a strange city, and you don't know anybody, you don't have a car, and so you hope that there's some interesting things in walking distance from your hotel, which often there weren't. It was hot in the south. It was really muggy. I mean, we got stuck a couple of days in Mobile, Alabama, which is a nice town. I like Mobile, but we were in this boring Holiday Inn, and there was just nothing. So a lot of just being in the hotel room service, turn on the TV. I remember the summer 81 is when they launched MTV, so that was new to see that, and it felt like there was change in the air with that thing happening in music videos.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But so doing the shows is great, but then it's just a lot of work and a lot of tedium involved, getting from one city to another. The bus rides could be really long, but the buses were well appointed. They were nice. They were extremely comfortable. Had video games and VCR. Somebody on the tour had a source for bootleg movies. We had bootleg copies of Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark and whatnot. But mostly, we would just sit on the bus and talk, and we got to be just such good friends. I mean, it's like a cliche to say that you work on a project like this, we're all a family. But I really felt like those guys were my brothers, and I just enjoyed the time that I spent with them, and I've kept in touch with a lot of them over the years. And I mentioned before David Williams. I miss him so much, the guitar player, because he was just so much fun and so talented. But Foot was great, Jonathan Moffat, and Alan Prater, the trombone player. We called him Funt. I don't know why he had that nickname, but everyone called him Funt. I think his tour jacket even said Funt. It was like Alan Funt, the guy from Candid Camera. But what does that have to do with the trombone player from Jacksonville, Florida? I don't know. But I talked to him not long ago. He's up in Montreal now, and we had a good talk on the phone. It's really great to be a part of something like that, and we just had a good time. But there's a lot of downtime and in between time and tedium. But that's just being on the road. That's the way that it goes. And that one of the cities that we had an extra day in was Buffalo, New York, and I arranged to take a tour of the Moog factory, which was right next door in Trumansville. And Bob Moog was out of town that day, so I didn't get to meet him. But it was fun, and they treated me like a real VIP, gave me the treatment. And the highlight was seeing Keith Emerson's giant modular synthesizer was in for servicing. And so I got to pose with that. And, yeah, that's every synthesizer player's dream was that giant beast. He was a lunatic to take that thing on the road, but he did. I should talk about the show aspects of the, I mean, it was a show. I mean, the spectacle aspects. Because I tend to focus on the music mostly because, and I was the keyboard player. But as I mentioned before, the stage was custom built for the show. It traveled with the show. It broke apart in pieces. And those guys, they were like the equivalent of roustabouts on the circus, they would have to, after the show, we get, limousines to our hotel rooms, like we're the stars. But the guys that did the real work, the unsung heroes, were the guys that had to break down the stage after the show. Sometimes they'd have to load up the trucks and drive all night to the next city, and a hard job. But they were professionals. I mean, they have roadies and they have a work ethic, a showbiz work ethic that can't be topped. I have all the respect in the world for those guys. But the show itself, the visual aspects that I should talk about, there were a couple of things. There was an illusion that Doug Henning provided, wherein Michael disappeared from one side of the stage, just vanished, and then shortly thereafter reappeared in a poof, magically. And in the meantime, when he reappeared, he had changed into the tuxedo and image that he had on off the wall, with the glittery socks and everything. And it was a great illusion. The crowd loved it. I won't give away how they did it, but part of it involved. That's why we needed a custom stage. And the other thing they had was there was an explosion every night, a big flame pot at a certain point of Heartbreak Hotel, also known as This Place Hotel. They should have renamed it This is Heartbreak Hotel. I don't know. This Place Hotel. And there was an explosion that came in the middle of that song, right after the bridge, boom, if the guy was right on. A lot of times on the tapes I've been watching on YouTube, he's a little late.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Rushing or dragging?
Rushing.
So you do know the difference.
But it's supposed to just hit right on that beat. And I remember one time there was a guy, his whole job, he was the Pyrotechnics guy. His whole job on the tour was just to take care of that thing. It had to be loaded with gunpowder and whatever you got to do. You know, it's like fireworks, you know. And his job was to make sure that thing was packed and ready to go. And Michael kept after him to make it bigger. And I heard him talking, the two of them talking at a sound check, and Michael was saying, no, it's got to be bigger, it's got to be bigger. And the guy said, Michael, if the fire marshal comes in, I'm already using twice as much powder as I'm supposed to. And he said, I just want it bigger, you know? And so it was big, and it was really loud, and it was right off the left side of the keyboard riser. And I think some of my hearing loss is attributed to that. But shortly after the tour got going, I became used to it. In fact, I would play that last chromatic run leading up to the explosion, and then I would duck with one hand over my left ear. I found one other little artifact on YouTube, and it's Michael introducing the band, and I had totally forgotten that he did that. So that's a nice souvenir. I've got Michael saying my name, and I think the reason I forgot it is because it's my favorite song. It's the one about the rat.
To accompany me with this song is my brother Randy on piano. Bill Whooper on synthesizer. Mike McKinney on bass. Wayne. Jonathan Moffett on drums. My brother Tito on guitar.
I'll tell you a little bit about little more about the structure of the show. It was always, I mentioned before, it was always the same. There wasn't a different set list, you know, nothing changed. The three encores were always planned. And the last song, this was a clever bit that the brothers came up with to extricate themselves from the thousands of screaming fans, is that when we were playing the very last song, and we knew this was the last song, it was Shake Your Body. Every night, the very last encore was Shake Your Body. And when it's in the vamp at the end of it, they said goodnight, and Michael and the brothers left the stage. And we in the band kept playing for a long time, 4 or 5 minutes. We'd keep that vamp going, which was fun, actually, because we could just kind of go nuts with it. My job at that point was just to play synthesizer bass on the Yamaha CS80, and it was just fun. I just loved that bass line, and I like to play fills with it, and probably played too many notes.
Good night, everybody.
But what was happening in the meantime, the audience didn't realize, is that when the brothers left the stage, they were each handed a towel, and they got straight into the limousine, and boom, Michael has left the building. They didn't know that. We'd get done, and the crowd's like, yay, yay. We'd go back to the dressing room. We changed our street clothes, And, 20 minutes later or so, the limo's ready to take us to our hotel, which is not the same hotel that the brothers were staying at, which was another, it was not just that they didn't want to, it didn't make economic sense to put a 8-piece band up at the Ritz-Carlton, but it was also another way to throw the fans off the scent, which they had. It was just, it was craziness. Twice during the tour, the phone in my hotel room rang, and invariably you'd be a little young girl saying, "Is Michael there?" And I go, "No, Michael's not here. Why would he be here? Don't call me." If I'd been mean, I would have said, "Wait, hey Mike, it's for you." "Hello?" I wouldn't do that. Anyway, so we got the brunt of it. We in the band had the brunt of it when the fans would come around behind whatever venue we were playing in, and they'd be waiting to see a limousine come out. And the worst of it was in New York. I think it was the first night that we played Madison Square Garden. They were waiting for us, and they swarmed the limo. And the limo couldn't move forward or backward, and they're screaming and they're pounding on the windows and rocking the limo back and forth, and it was pandemonium. And all of a sudden I look up and I see a giant horse's ass out the window. Seriously, literally, because it was the New York Mounted Police that were encouraging the crowd to move along, which they did. Thank goodness. It was frightening because they had gone berserk. So that was, it was another reason why the brothers always stayed at a different hotel. Those things were just absolutely crazy. But it was fun. A lot of celebrities came out for the tour. Magic Johnson was a fixture. He's a huge Jackson's fan, and vice versa. The brothers and everybody loved him. He was just such a great guy, and we all got to know him because he came to practically all the tour. It was just go back in the dressing room. There's Magic. And I remember in New York at the sound check, Michael brought Liza Minnelli onto the stage and introduced her to us. And she was very gracious and nice. And then one of the nights in New York, got word that Katharine Hepburn was in the crowd. I didn't get to meet her, but I poked my head out and I saw her sitting there. She had brought a couple of her grandkids to see the show. And she was immediately recognized because it was Katharine Hepburn, but it was also, that was the year she did On Golden Pond. So there she was. And then later in L.A., everybody came out for the L.A. shows. It was star-studded. Oh, also in New York, Herbie Hancock came, and he came back to the dressing room. It was the only time that it was stupid. I got nervous that night playing in New York. It was in Madison Square Garden, 20,000 people. But I had never been nervous the whole tour. But that night, for some reason, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, Herbie Hancock is listening to me play, and I better, which was dumb because he didn't come to listen to the keyboard player. He was enjoying the show. In L.A. was the end of the tour, and there was a party at the on the very last night in a room that I didn't even know existed at the L.A. Forum, a private room, and we all knew to go to the party. And I went in there, and Dick Griffey from Solar Records was arguing with the security guy, who was this guy saying, "Well, your name isn't on the list, you aren't getting in here." And Dick Griffey said, "Look, I promoted this show." He was angry. And I just told the guy my name, and he said, "Yeah, go ahead." And it was just kind of weird, because that was my first experience close up with Dick Griffey. And 2 years later, I signed a deal to be an artist and producer on his record label. He got into the party later. He had to argue. I always hated that scene of So but another night in New York, there was a guy backstage, came along with flyers, say, hey, we're throwing a party for the Jacksons at Studio 54. So we're going, oh, Studio 54, that's like that super famous disco, you know? You think back, all the stories of this, like, mid-'70s was really its heyday when Andy Warhol and Mick Jagger and all the beautiful people hung out at Studio 54, right? So we go around to Studio 54, and it's the same thing. This is a guy saying, no, you can't come in. And we've got the flyers. We were invited. We're wearing our tour jackets. And the guy goes, no, you can't come in. And then it became like, no, we will get in. We were invited. We got determined. A couple of the guys said, to hell with it. We finally got in, and the place was like, its heyday, like I said, was about 5 years before. Andy Warhol was not there. The beautiful people had gone. And all it was this dopey disco that the people in it were just looking around to go, who's this? Is that somebody? No, there's nobody. Never mind. And it stunk. It had that disco aroma of vomit and spilled cocktails and sweat and lust. And so Studio 54 was kind of a disappointment. But the party after the tour, the party to end the tour at the Forum was great. Everybody was there. And Prince was there. And I was excited to see him because I was a fan. This is 81. This is like 2-3 years before Purple Rain, but he'd already had some hits. But he had 2 giant bodyguards bookending him. And he was just casting out this look like, no, you may not approach. I would have liked to have just told him that I liked his music. Because I was a fan, from his first album in 79. But just the look on his face said, stay away. But there he was. Why he came to the party, I don't know. He didn't stay long. But it was cool just to see him there. And I'm just going around the party, and everybody is there. And I saw Michael sitting at a table with Stevie Wonder, Quincy Jones, and this other guy. And I thought, I got to get a picture of this. I had my camera. And I climbed up on a chair because the room was so crowded, I couldn't get a clear shot unless I got up on a chair. And I climbed up on a chair, and Michael starts waving at me. And I think he's just like, he's waving for my camera. And so I take some shots. Later, Michael comes and finds me. He says, why didn't you come over to the table when I was waving at you? And I said, well, I just thought you were saying hi. He said, no, I wanted to introduce you to Steven Spielberg. Get out of here. I got the film developed back the next week, and I look at the pictures, and yeah, that's Steven Spielberg there. And the reason Michael wanted to introduce me to Steven Spielberg is that one of the ways that Michael and I became closer friends is we talk about movies. We talked about movies more than we talked about music. And it was even back during the rehearsals. I had an opportunity to see a word-of-mouth screening of a Spielberg film. And the next day I went to rehearsal, and I was the word of mouth for that because I said, you guys have got to go see this movie when it comes out. Not just Michael, I was telling everybody in the band, it was Raiders of the Lost Ark. And seeing that thing for the first time without knowing anything about it was just the most fun you're ever going to have. And so I told Michael about it. And of course, when it came out, he went to see it and he loved it. Because who didn't? I mean, that was so much fun. That was the movie of the summer, was Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so Michael knew I was a fan of the movie. He wanted to introduce me to Steven Spielberg. So I missed that chance. Another time that Michael and I talked about movies, I ran into him at a video rental store on Hollywood Boulevard. There used to be one. It was like across from the Hollywood Roosevelt, somewhere down around there. But he was in there, and he was kind of wearing this disguise. He had like a fedora hat and the shades. And I said, hi, Michael. He said, how'd you know it was me? And I said, 'cause I know you. But we spent about 40 minutes just walking all along pointing at the movies. Did you see that one? Oh yeah, I love that movie. You know, that kind of thing. And that was fun. He loved movies, and I love movies too. So that was that. The party, the tour was over. There had been talk of extending it to Europe, and I was disappointed that didn't happen. And I don't know why it didn't happen, but it didn't. And the only thing that was left after that, there was a party at one of the brothers' house. I think it was Jackie's house. And they all live up in Encino. And they had a cake, you know, that looked like the Triumph album, and the whole family was there. And that was basically it. But the thing that was left to do was to work on the live album. And they had recorded, I think, in Atlanta and Providence. I don't know. I think they recorded 2 or 3 concerts. And so they spent time listening to the recordings and picking the songs that were the better performances. And then we, all the musicians, had to come in and do some fix-up work. And it not a lot of people know that live albums can be tinkered with in this way. But what happens on a modern live pop or rock album is it's recorded with a mobile truck that has a 24-track full studio in it, 2-inch tape, the whole 9 yards. And so you can go fix individual clinkers, mistakes, clams, Buddy Rich would call them.
You stand out here all fucking night trying to blow your fucking brains out and I come trying to play. What do you play? Clams? You got nowhere to fucking go the next day, because if I hear one fucking clam from anybody, you've had it. One clam and this whole fucking band is through tonight. Try me.
And there were many. I mean, it's when you're playing live, somebody's gonna, their timing will be off. They hit a wrong note, whatever. And usually it's just, that's ephemeral. It just goes out in the air and nobody worries about it. But if you're making something that's a record and you're not there in the moment, you want it to be right. And so they were fixing vocals and all the instruments, bass, drums, keyboards. I didn't have too many clams, but I had a few. There were a few. And then that was that. There were a couple of days that I was involved doing that. And because I like hanging around recording studios, I went back when they were mixing it. And it was horrifying. The way they were mixing it was they had it playing through the large speakers at top volume. And I guess they were trying to approximate the way it would have sounded in the arena. But that's nobody mixes like that. It's just, there's a reason they have those little itty bitty speakers in recording studios, because when you mix, you've got to make the record sound the way that it's going to, it has to translate to normal speakers. And normally people were not going to be listening to that album on these giant, huge studio monitors. Most studios, the big monitors are just there to impress prospective clients, and you hardly ever turn them on otherwise. Maybe once in a while to check the bass on something. But generally, you just get to know the sound of a particular small set of speakers, and if they're crummy speakers, so much the better. Bob Clearmountain began that with using Yamaha NS10 bookshelf speakers, which were kind of mid-range, crappy hi-fi speakers. And if you could, the theory is if you can make it sound good on that, it'll sound good on anything. But that live album didn't sound good on anything, because it sounded thin and small, because there was so much bass when they were playing it back over those giant speakers. It didn't translate. But that's what happened. And I always said that I did not like the tempos. So, I mean, I'm glad that that record is there for a souvenir, but I never listened to it. It's funny, I had an interview with some people in France, and one of the guys, the first time he had ever heard songs like Don't Stop Till You Get Enough was from that live record. And then when he went to rediscover it on Off the Wall, he thought, well, this is so slow. He'd gotten used to these ultra fast tempos. Like Heartbreak Hotel was like a bebop tempo. Whatever. That's what that was. But all in all, it was great. Like I said before, I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I did it. They asked me to go the next year on the Victory Tour. And by that time, not the next year, that was 84. But by that time, well, I had obtained a deal as an artist and a producer for Solar Records. And I didn't want to go out of town and miss any opportunities for producing records that would come up. But I just felt like studio was where I wanted to be. And that's where I stayed. I helped them find my replacement. Actually, they had 2 keyboard players to replace me. And I think it was Rory Kaplan that I introduced. They had Rory and Pat Leonard. I don't know if I introduced. I'm forgetting. It's been, 40 years. But so I didn't go on that, and I didn't go on the road. I concentrated on studio work. I worked with Michael again in the studio several times. And those can be stories for another time. But that's basically what I remember of the tour. I'll probably remember other things later, but it's too bad. I hope you enjoyed hearing the stories. And we'll see you next time. Bye.